I rise today to commemorate an important but largely unheralded anniversary. 70 years ago yesterday, President Harry Truman changed the design of the presidential flag and seal. That moment, which is a small moment in the grand scope of American history, was nevertheless very symbolic, and I'd like to discuss it. First, some context on President Truman. Truman was a great wartime president. He fought bravely in World War I in France, and then he had to make very momentous decisions at the close of World War II. Some would argue, and I think properly, that the decision about whether or not to use atomic weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki might have been the single most momentous decision ever made by a president. He wasn't even aware of the Manhattan Project and development of the atomic weapons program until FDR died in April of 1945, and within a very few months had to make the decision about whether to use those weapons against Japan. So nobody would question or challenge whether Harry Truman was a softie. In fact, even after World War II, in March of 1947, America was war-weary, but he went to Congress and in an address to Congress said, "We need to continue to provide military and economic support to nations that are battling against Soviet influence." In this case, it was the nations of Greece and Turkey. And that began the Truman Doctrine, the basic strategic principle whereby the United States for the next 40 years would sort of check off efforts by the Soviet Union to expand their influence. Harry Truman was a great wartime president. But Harry Truman did something on October 25, 1945 that was most unusual. He called the press into his office and he said, "Look what I've done." And he unveiled the fact that he had taken the seal and flag of the presidency of the United States and redesigned them. And that design is essentially the same today, with the exception that 2 stars were added for the states of Alaska and Hawaii that came in after the Truman presidencies. The seal of the president, as everybody knows, if we can look around the room, we can see some up on the wall here. Originally, the seal was an eagle, and the eagle has 2 claws. And in one set of claws, the eagle is grasping the arrows of war, and in the other set of claws, the eagle is grasping the olive branches of peace and diplomacy. Prior to the Truman presidency, the eagle faced toward the arrows of war. And Harry Truman, this great wartime president, changed the seal so that the olive branches of diplomacy would be in the right claw, the sort of preferred position, and the eagle would be facing toward the olive branches. When he did this, he said, "The new flag faces the eagle toward the staff, which is looking to the front all of the time when you're on the march. And it also has the eagle looking at the olive branch for peace instead of the arrows of war." Truman biographer David McCullough stated that Truman meant this shift in the eagle's gaze to be seen as symbolic of a nation that was on the march and dedicated to peace and diplomacy. Significantly, right around the same time, President Truman did something else that was notable and symbolic. He renamed the department that we think of as the Pentagon from the Department of War to the Department of Defense, also symbolic of the nation's post-war dedication to peace. While we want to be the strongest, and we are the strongest military nation in the world, and Madam President, you know this so very well, we want to always suggest to the world that our interest is not primarily war. No, our interest is peace and prosperity for all. We always have to preserve and advance America's military strength because we know of the connection. Sometimes the better your military strength, the more successful you can be diplomatically. But it is also the case that the strength of your diplomacy can also add to the credibility of your military might. I want to talk quickly about the olive branches of peace and diplomacy and then the arrows of war. The olive branches of peace and diplomacy. America has a great diplomatic tradition. Let's just talk about recent presidential history. President Truman went to Congress and said, "Let's spend, in today's dollars, tens of billions of dollars to rebuild the economies of Japan and Germany." The 2 nations that had been at war against the United States. Germany had been engaged in 2 wars with the United States in the previous 30 years. Japan had invaded the United States at Pearl Harbor, but President Truman said, "Tomorrow's more important than yesterday. Let's spend dollars to rebuild these economies." It was controversial when he proposed it, but the Marshall Plan ended up being one of the most successful things that the United States has done from a foreign policy perspective. President Kennedy. Right after the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, President Kennedy engaged in negotiations with the Soviet Union to reduce the nuclear threat, and the result was in an agreement in 1963 to ban atmospheric nuclear tests, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. President Reagan was actively engaged in trying to undermine the power of Soviet Union and communism, but during those very vigorous and aggressive activities, he also was negotiating with the Soviet Union on arms control agreements. Probably the paramount example of this during the Reagan presidency was the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty in 1987 that he successfully negotiated. And I happen to believe that history is going to judge the recent Iran nuclear deal in the same way, an effort to make tomorrow more important than yesterday and find, even in the midst of significant challenges between the United States and Iran, a way to reduce nuclear tension. Diplomacy is always a judgment that we should try to let go of some of the baggage of the past and see if we can find a better way to tomorrow. Madam President, I'm a little bit worried that the Truman legacy of putting peace and diplomacy first is fraying in this body and maybe nationally. And I hope by bringing to mind this anniversary today, just to remind us of our great diplomatic history and the power of our diplomatic principles. In recent years, what we've seen in this chamber, we've seen a number of bits of evidence of a fraying commitment to diplomacy, in my view. One of the great Truman institutions was the International Monetary Fund, designed to help nations work together on economic and monetary policy issues. Great global institution. The challenge with an institution like that is when you set it up in the 1940s and then new nations emerge and rise, how do you incorporate nations that are newly powerful into the fund? And the most recent example, a challenging example, has been the nation of China. As China has gotten more and more important, there were many who advised us to bring China more closely into the fund so that they could assist nations throughout the world. But Congress refused to change the bylaws of the IMF to give China proportionate responsibility given its population and the strength of its economy. And what did China do after we would not change the bylaws to allow them a proportionate place at the table? China established their own development bank completely separate from the IMF. There's a debate going on right now in Congress about whether or not we should reauthorize the Exim Bank, one of the premier, now this dates back to FDR presidency, a premier institution that helps American companies find export markets abroad. Again, part of our broad diplomatic effort to outreach, and suddenly it's controversial after 80 years. There are a number of UN treaties that we could profitably advance our interests by. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, if the U.S. had ratified that, we would have an additional diplomatic tool to challenge Chinese island building in the South China Sea. The UN Treaty on the Rights of Women, the UN Treaty on the Rights of Those with Disabilities. These are treaties that, frankly, would reflect American values and American principles because we're leaders in the world in these areas, and yet we won't ratify the treaties. The prospect of trade deals are much less popular in Congress than they were 15 years ago. Trade is going to happen. The question is whether the United States will be will play a leadership role in writing the rules. And if we step back and we don't play a leadership role, some other nations will, but these are getting more and more complicated here in this body. And then finally, Madam President, something that I feel very strongly, it's hard to face the world with this strong diplomatic might when you have a lot of ambassadorial positions that are vacant. And especially in the last 6 or 7 years, we've seen efforts to block or delay ambassadorial appointments that have left key posts in many nations around the world vacant. And it sends a message to other countries when they look at us as the United States not putting an ambassador in place, they basically conclude, well, the U.S. may not think we're important. And that is a very, very bad signal to send to other nations, especially many nations that our allies have been without ambassadors for a while. So I'm hoping that we can re-embrace in the 70th anniversary the wisdom of a Truman who said the nation has to be vigorous and forceful and look toward diplomacy first. Now, with respect to the arrows of war, I'm on the Armed Services Committee, and just like President Truman, I prefer diplomacy. I think we should lead with diplomacy, but we have to be willing to use military force. And I voted for military force twice during my 3 years in the Senate. The president asked us to vote for military force against Syria to punish Bashar al-Assad for using chemical weapons against civilians. That was in August of 2013. The only vote that was taken in either house was a vote in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I voted for it with kind of a foreboding and a heavy heart, because I knew there would be Virginians, some of whom I might know, who would be affected. But nevertheless, I thought it was an important principle for America to stand for. And I've also been pushing since September of 2014 to have Congress cast a vote to authorize the war against ISIL that has now been going for 15 months. There's a lot of critique in this body, and I have critique about the way that war is being waged, about strategic decisions that the president is undertaking with respect to the war. But I think at the end of the day, it's hard just to be a critic. Under Article 1 of the Constitution, it's supposed to be Congress that authorizes war rather than a president just doing it on his own. I mentioned the point earlier, the Truman olive branches of diplomacy and arrows of war reinforce one another. Obviously, you can be a stronger negotiator at the table in advancing a diplomatic solution if people understand that you have significant military capacity and the willingness to use it in the appropriate instance. So the more we can do, the better we can do to empower our military through wise budgeting, for example, as we hope to find an end to sequester and a path forward, the stronger we'll make our diplomatic effort. And similarly, the reverse is also true. The more we are vigorous in going after diplomacy, the more moral credibility we have in those instances where we can say, looking at the world, looking at our citizens, looking at our own troops, we now think we need to take military action, and we have exhausted the diplomatic alternatives first. That improves the moral credibility behind military effort. It enables us to make the case better to all about the need for military effort, and often it even creates a better international law justification for military effort. As I conclude, Madam President, I think you and I were together last week when former Secretary Gates testified before the Armed Services Committee, and it was one of the best bits of testimony that I've seen in my time in the Senate. He had a word of caution for us. He said, quote, "While it's tempting to assert that the challenges facing the United States internationally have never been more numerous or complex, the reality is that turbulent, unstable, and unpredictable times have recurred to challenge U.S. leaders regularly since World War II. We do live in a very complex and challenging world where we see challenges that are known, but also many unpredictable challenges. But other leaders of this country since our first days have lived in worlds that looked equally challenging and confusing to them. But we're true to our best traditions if the U.S. does what Truman so emblematically suggested we should do. And we push in a vigorous and creative way all the diplomatic tools at our disposal. And that involves diplomacy, but also involves trade and humanitarian assistance. The U.S. is one of the most generous nations in the world. And the strength of our moral example, that's something that stands as so important. If you live in a nation where journalists are being put in jail, the U.S. freedom of the press stands as a moral example. If you live in a nation where people are being prosecuted because of their sexual orientation, the U.S. stands as a great moral example. We're not exemplary in everything. We have room to improve in everything. But we're exemplary in so many things, and people around the world still look at us. And that is, in fact, a diplomatic area of importance. Let's just be exemplary and stand strongly for the principles that we espouse. And finally, I'll say this. So many of the challenges that we're facing now are challenges that at the end of the day really are about diplomatic solutions. We often are in Armed Services or the Foreign Relations Committee are talking about the vexing conundrum, the humanitarian disaster in Syria, but we hear at the end of the day it has to be about a political solution to the civil war. There has to be a political solution to the conflict in Yemen. There has to be a political solution to the decades-long conflict between the Taliban and the government in Afghanistan. To find a political solution, you have to have strong diplomacy. Military action will not be enough to forge a political consensus moving forward. So ultimately, this was the message of what Harry Truman did 70 years ago. This strong wartime president, who made some of the toughest decisions that have ever been made by anybody in the Oval Office, recognized that America was a great nation because when push came to shove, we would prefer and push and advocate for diplomacy first, knowing that we would be militarily strong if we needed to be. And it is my hope that we in Congress will take a lesson from that anniversary and continue to pursue that same path. And with that, Madam President, I yield the floor.